Thanks for joining me. I'm back in Llanboidy in North Carmarthenshire, this time looking at the churchyard. The church of St Brynach dates from the medieval period, but like many Welsh churches had fallen into disrepair over the centuries and was heavily restored in 1878. Much of the work was paid for by Walter Rice Howell Powell of Maesgwyn, the local squire. It sits in the middle of the village and was the centre of religious life in the village for centuries until the nonconformist movement began to grow here. In the first part of this video, I'm going to explain how the establishment of local chapels and meeting houses caused a split in the community, which had implications for social life, the burial of the dead, and was linked to the politics of the time. In the second part, I'll look at some of the gravestones and talk about the people buried here and their interesting epitaphs. In 1800, the Independents built a chapel just over the road from the church. People now had a choice of where to worship. Its members were drawn from the working population of the village. The church had a wider mix of people from the gentry to the pauper, but everyone, chapel or church, had to pay tithes to the church, and that caused resentment amongst the chapel goers who didn't see why they should pay money to the church. Schools taught the Church of England catechism regardless of the religious affiliation of the pupils. This was opposed by Welsh politicians, including Lloyd George and Squire Powell too, who stopped this in his school in Llanboidy. The pressure from the Welsh Liberals to disestablish the Anglican Church in Wales met with a lot of resistance from the Tory party, particularly from Frederick Edwin Smith, later the Earl of Birkenhead. Smith was a brilliant barrister and MP, a fiery orator, tall and lean, a heavy drinker, outspoken to the point of rudeness, and who was described as pure 18th century in his attitude. Eventually the bill was passed in 1914, but the First World War meant that it didn't come into force until 1920. Although there was some ill feeling between the nonconformist and Anglican Church members, often about politics and the role of the gentry, there was much more acrimony often between the different chapels. Nonconformists often had deep theological differences, and groups within a chapel would leave and set up their own chapels nearby. Squire Powell was a local MP, first Conservative and later Liberal, and although church and not chapel, he was supported by the members of the local chapels. And the Band of Hope in Llanboidy was non-denominational and united members of both church and chapel in social activities. Squire Powell was buried in the churchyard. A statue once on his grave is inside the church now. Buried near him are another gentry family. This is really Gentry Corner at Llanboidy, but not exclusively. Close to the Powell vault we find the pedimented headstone of Richard Denny Fitzpatrick, which was paid for by Squire Powell's father as a lasting monument to a valued servant. I can't find anything out about Richard, but his name suggests he might have been Irish. His epitaph says he lived and worked at Maesgwyn as a faithful servant for 13 years. Studious of peace, he hated strife, and friendship filled his breast. His coat of arms, a quiet life, an honest heart his crest. So, although not a titled man, or with a real heraldic coat of arms, Richard Denny Fitzpatrick's character and the benevolence of his master ensured that his servant lies close to him. Squire Powell gave the same honour to his groom, Theophilus Gibbon, who also served his father and worked at Maesgwyn for 25 years. So the Powell vault has a servant on either side. However kind the gesture, it separated Theophilus Gibbon from his widow at her death. She was a member of Ramoth Baptist Chapel, as he may have been. Dying after him, she was buried there. In fact, she might not have been allowed to be buried with him had she wanted to. Until the Burial Act of 1880, 7 years after her death, Church of England clergymen could refuse burial in their churchyards to nonconformists, and if allowed, could prevent the nonconformist ministers from conducting the ceremony. Moving a little way down the social strata, we find this granite pillar to the Thomas and Phillips families. Jason Thomas was a surgeon who died in 1841, leaving a widow, Anne, and his children, Catherine, David Lewis, Mary Ann, and Sarah. Mary and Elizabeth, their infant children who died before their parents, have small headstones nearby. Catherine and Mary Ann went on to have very different lives from each other. Catherine never married. She died in 1896. She spent her latter years at Sweetbriar, in the house her sister lived in, with her well-off but fiercely puritanical chapel deacon, retired merchant, for husband. That must have led to some interesting dinner-table conversations, as Catherine was, to quote in her obituary, a staunch supporter of the Church of England. Mary Ann's husband had been married before, so as his second wife she became the stepmother to his children, and also had children with him. Their daughter, Elizabeth, married the minister of Trinity Chapel and is buried there. Mary Ann's husband, the deacon, went to a chapel in a different village and is buried there. Mary Ann's stepson, Benjamin Lewis Phillips, was brought up chapel. He became a solicitor, married the sister of the minister of Trinity Chapel, and seems to have crossed the road to the church at some point, as he's buried here. He did well to rise from being a grocer's son to being a successful solicitor in Cardiff. In 1897 he was bathing in the sea at Barry Island when he got out of the sea and suddenly became unconscious. He was revived by a doctor but was in a dangerous condition for some time. He survived this accident, but in 1899 his solicitor's office was destroyed in a gas explosion. Luckily he was not present at the time. He then returned to practice in Llanboidy, dying in 1938. Nearby we find two matching pedimented headstones to the children of Benjamin and Elizabeth Thomas, farmers at Llanybydder. Margaret died in 1857, aged 3 years and 8 months. Her epitaph reads, "Beneath this stone in sweet repose is laid a mother's dearest pride, a flower that scarce had waked to life and light and beauty ere it died. God in his wisdom has recalled the precious boon his love had given, and though the casket moulder here, the gem is sparkling now in heaven." 2 years later, on September the 9th, 1859, another child, Esther, died at the age of only 17 months. Her epitaph, "And I am withered like grass," continues the same theme in the only available space, so is necessarily shorter. 15 days later their son John died, aged 8 years and 5 months. There is no epitaph, but plenty of space. I wonder if they were braced to add more sad names, or whether the early piety and Christian resignation had deserted them by this point. Thomas and Elizabeth are buried beside their lost little ones, with a headstone showing a weeping willow. 3 children survived into adulthood, Elizabeth, Catherine and Margaret, who stayed with them on the farm. In the opposite corner of the churchyard we find another farming family, the Jameses of Rhondda Damaris James lived until the age of 83. James and Sarah James were also long-lived, aged 82 and 88. Their children did not fare so well. Gad Alban died in 1855, aged 18. Esther died in 1859, aged 25. Rachel died in 1861, aged 21, and Britannia died in 1870, aged 27. Now to those who earned their living in the village. George Phillips was a schoolmaster in the village. His epitaph reads, "He was a good and very useful man, much respected by his neighbours, and of whom may well be said, he was powerful in the Scripture." The other side of the stone is to Anne Rees, the daughter of John and Anne Rees of the Lamb Inn, who died aged 4. Her father was Squire Powell's huntsman, as well as an innkeeper. Another daughter, Anne, died in 1879, aged 21, and the oldest son became a vet in Surrey. Henry Jenkins was a glove maker. Ezra and John were the infant children of George and Frances Lewis. George was a boot and shoemaker who had other children, including William Gladstone Lewis, whose name rather gives away his father's political leanings. He emigrated to America. Benjamin Griffiths is buried here with his wife Hester. They kept the Maesgwyn Arms, which was the hotel which Squire Powell built for his racing friends to stay in when race meetings were held in Llanboidy. Their daughter, who was only 11 months, is buried here too, but her mother's name here is given as Esther, not Hester. She appears to have gained an H as she aged. David William was a stonemason. He died in 1844, aged 55. A year later his son Thomas followed him to the grave, aged only 20. Thomas Williams was also a stonemason. He was also a keen vegetable and indoor plant grower who won prizes at the exhibition of local horticulture organised by Mrs. Powell. He lived with his wife Margaret and 4 children and his widowed mother at No. 1 Piccadilly. Piccadilly Square was a group of improved houses built by Squire Powell. It's built right up against the churchyard, and that part of the churchyard is the resting place of another family who lived there. Stephen Reynolds was a butcher. He was a neighbour of Thomas Williams the mason. He and his wife Elizabeth had 6 children. 4 are buried here. William John, who died in 1882, aged 4. Jane, who died in 1887, aged 8. Rebecca, who died in 1893, aged 23, and James, who died aged 80 in 1932. Jonah Williams was another mason and another neighbour of Thomas Williams and Stephen Reynolds at Piccadilly Square. He too won prizes for his horticultural efforts. The gardens at Piccadilly Square were certainly productive. He and his wife Anne are buried next to the Reynolds, lying close to the homes they lived in, and in death as in life, next-door neighbours. Finally we have this headstone. I could find nothing at all about Anna Phillips. Her name, age and date of death, nothing else, except her epitaph, which is pithy and to the point. Vain words on tombs are often spent, but a good name is a monument. I hope you enjoyed this look round the churchyard at Llanboidy. Please remember to click the like button and subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon so you can be the first to see new videos. Thank you for watching.